I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today is a special day.
Is it?
It is. The listener doesn't know this, but Rob has received a scholarship from the Chateaubriand to study the nexus between French and Chinese in Paris. He's going to be at the Sorbonne.
Yes.
And that means that this may be the last podcast we have sitting side by side for a little while.
Possibly we'll meet up in China. There's a possibility that you'll be in at least Taiwan like the year after it. I'm going to be in China the year after that, or the same year you are, so possibly.
Now, the listener should know that the way we record these is that we actually have a whole bullpen full of podcasts that will be coming after. And so the listener might not immediately notice a change, but Rob will probably be Skyping in for the foreseeable future when we're recording.
And of course, that might not come into effect until 7 months from now, but still.
7 months from whenever we put this podcast on.
Yes.
We were trying to think of a good goodbye.
Quasi-farewell podcast.
Quasi-farewell podcast.
Quasi,
Chinese literature is full of poems.
Right.
That are essentially goodbye poems.
Right.
And we chose a very famous one by Li Shangyin. This is entitled No Title.
Yeah.
The first line is very famous. It's 想尽时难别亦难. So it was hard to meet you and hard to bid you goodbye. Is how that first line is translated.
We should give some background on Li Shangyin, when he wrote, what he wrote.
That's a good point.
We're looking at a kind of a contemporary of Li Bai and Du Fu. This is Tang Dynasty poetry.
He's about a generation after Li Bai and Du Fu.
This would be coming, and there's a whole wave of poets that come after Li Bai and Du Fu, Bai Juyi, for example. And so he's coming after them. I don't know if I could characterize all of his poems. He's one of these poets a little hard to describe.
He's maybe more melancholic than Du Fu. Du Fu was more thinking about Confucianism and the state. Li Shangyin is... Well, he's got a lot more sexual poems. He's oftentimes criticized as a very sexualized Tang poet.
But he's coming out of the same tradition that's giving us a lot of poems that are using natural imagery in very interesting ways, ways that I don't think... It's so interesting that I don't see something similar done until the 20th century in terms of how peculiarly or uniquely you use natural imagery. Not just metaphorical, but in this poem, for example, which is a farewell poem, there's a line where it talks about the east wind, and then it talks about 100 flowers by Hua Can. That character, Can, is, you can translate it a lot of ways, brutal, difficult, painful, but that's not a word you would necessarily put after 100 flowers or beautiful flowers or anything to do with flowers. You wouldn't put Can like wretched or painful flowers, but it's that connection between, it's that sort of tension that you're supposed to actually feel the difficulty of bidding farewell to someone when you have something that's great but also painful. So why don't we actually just read a quick translation of the poem, and then we'll talk about it a little more.
This is Li Shangyin with No Title.
The official Lee Moore translation.
It was hard to meet and hard to part. The east wind is weak, the 100 flowers are withering. The spring silkworms move towards death, the silk is done. The candle grows gray, wax tears grow dry. She looks into the mirror but worries that her hair is changing. At night she chants, the moon's chill is all she knows. The mystic home is not far away. The bluebird will be the messenger of my love.
You looked at me when you were saying that last line, which is a little disturbing. But, you know.
Oh, I think the message is clear.
There's this. This is a Sam and Diane and Cheers sort of tension that runs all through the podcast. Are they really? Yeah. Anyway. One of the things that's really stunning about Tang Dynasty poetry, and it really, I can't emphasize enough how much a part of just the classics, the masterpieces of world literature, Tang poetry is its ability to do in a very, very small amount of space what other poems would take pages to do.
And I think that's the essence of all poetry, but I think Tang Dynasty poetry just does it
By the time people like Li Shangyin are writing, there's already several not just acceptable forms of poetry, but regulated forms of poetry. There's regulated verse was one style, but there are a couple of kinds of poems that people are writing, and in order to be called that kind of poem, you have to do it in a certain way. And we've talked quite a bit about Dufu, but Dufu did for poetry sort of what Bach did for music, which was to take a very rigidly defined and structured form and just do things with it that no one had ever done. The generation after them, people are starting to sort of tinker with that a little bit, but a lot of the same material and a lot of the same execution is still there. You'll notice, for example, in this poem, you have a direct comment in the beginning, which is Li Shangyin telling us what's going on. He's saying goodbye to someone. Or the poet the poet persona he's adopting is saying goodbye to someone. And what follows, we only know that they are connected because the situations he's describing bear that out. But we don't see any connective language. We don't see anything that says, it is like this, it is as this, or saying goodbye to you is as this thing. We simply see the image itself, and we have to make the mental connection. And that's something fairly common in Tang poetry.
Dynasty poetry, yeah. These images are just juxtaposed side by side. I think for most Tang readers, it would have been clear what the bluebird means and things like that. I think coming from a greater distance chronologically, it's harder for us to interpret, though they're still very fascinating, and it's still this poem that's kind of laced with melancholia, today's word of the day.
And it's interesting because every image you get in this poem is something beautiful or rich that is running out. The silkworm, for example.
The candle.
The candle. A beautiful woman wondering if her hair is going gray, wondering if...
Which is interesting, in the Chinese, or the original, it doesn't actually say anything about a woman, but it's assumed that it is a woman.
Yeah, and of course that's a fairly gender-specific idea that's sort of being dismantled now, but for many generations...
That's very common in Li Shangyin.
Yes, exactly. But it's interesting because in addition to simply pointing us out to the opening comment, these images are put into play together too. The woman examining her hair in the mirror, the candle, the silkworm, the bluebird. They all sort of explain each other. They don't simply point back to the opening thing. You know, we don't have, obviously, this would take a much longer podcast to unpack all that. But how is a dripping candle like a woman looking at herself in the mirror? Well, on the one hand, it's just time passing, but the opening comment is about saying farewell. It's not about time passing, it's time ending. You have this image simply in your mind of something wonderful that is running down, and it's almost as though you have to read the poem in reverse, right? You're saying the only time you would say goodbye to a candle is when the candle's no more, right? But in that line, it's running down. And the only time you would say goodbye to a woman in this context is if she's no more. Right?
Yeah, there's this sense of exhaustion, as if the friendship mentioned at the beginning, the goodbye and hello that's mentioned in that very first line, is sort of being exhausted. I'm not clear if they're leaving. It's assumed that someone's leaving, but it's not really clear if it's actually just the end of a friendship. I don't know. It makes it, to me, it feels like the images suggest that the friendship is ending for maybe, like, it's just been exhausted. I think exhausted is the word that strikes me in this poem.
And it's interesting because one of the things that makes the best Tang Dynasty poetry so universal is that it's using images that are universal. There aren't too many cultures on the planet that could not identify with growing older, or a candle dripping down, or a bird, a seasonal bird. Things like this resonate globally, universally. One of the things that poets in the 20th century, especially in the 1980s, start doing is take these universal images and de-universalize them, make them weird or peculiar. But in the Tang Dynasty, they're not made weird and peculiar. They are sometimes paired in weird ways, but the images are still intact.
And I often wonder if that has anything to do with this sort of Tang Dynasty claim to rule the entire world, to be a sort of universal ruler, which is common throughout Chinese dynasties, but the Tang Dynasty has particularly strong claim to that at some points.
I'm sure Li Shangyin is certainly feeding off of a lot of that.
But there's the sense, so the other Li Shangyin poem we've discussed, there was a sense that this is somehow a political reading. He goes to the top of the hill and he sees the sun setting. And I wonder, do you see that here? Like, is there something going on here? Li Shangyin is writing towards the end of the Tang Dynasty. Of course, Li Shangyin does not know.
Right, that the Tang Dynasty is ending.
But later literary critics have read Li
certainly,
Shangyin in that way.
Well, and this would certainly have been after the Anlushan Rebellion, which is...
Oh, yeah.
And the Tang never really recovered from the Anlushan Rebellion.
Yeah, after the Anlushan Rebellion, power was distributed to local rulers, and the imperial center lost a lot.
It begins to fracture, and you'd have to be fairly stupid not to feel it in the wind. To specify, this doesn't, we're not just reading into this poem. Chinese poets from practically the beginning.
This is an incredibly common reading.
It's very well known for poets to intentionally take things that seem fairly banal, like a flower or a bird, and make it a political allegory.
Right.
And the only way you would know it as a political allegory is if you've read enough of the other poetry to be able to scan it as such. And so I think you could be right. I mean, he could be writing about not simply saying goodbye to a person, but to an entire era, an entire dynasty as well. I mean, he obviously, like you said, he wouldn't know the dynasty is ending, but something is fading, something is ending.
And also, if you were to make that kind of direct claim, off with your head, kind of, that would not be a good career choice.
No, it would not be. And in fact, it has never been a good career choice in China. Now it isn't even a good career choice in China.
No.
And I can't stress this enough for those of our listeners who are just getting into Chinese literature, how important poetry is. And it's the poetry's ability to be somewhat cryptic and difficult to read that sometimes makes it able to carry more political weight, because you can sneak it under the eyes of those in power, right? So the emperor isn't going to read every poem ever written because it just takes too freaking long.
And even if he did,
has he read enough poetry to know what you're talking about?
And can you even really pin that down?
Right, exactly.
It's not so clear.
The poet could say, well, I wasn't writing about that. I was, like Li Shangyin could say, I was just saying goodbye to someone. Why are you getting so upset, right? Yeah. And there would be certainly grounds for that. And this is something that continues to the modern age. Online poetry is a big deal in China.
The Cultural Revolution was actually started by the vice mayor of Beijing writing a play, a drama, about a Ming Dynasty figure that was really directed more towards Mao Zedong. And that was what Mao Zedong used to start the Cultural Revolution. So it's definitely going on.
Poetry is charged all through China with profound political implications.
And this poem, I think you have to read it politically.
Well, but this is one of the things that I love about this poetry is that you certainly can, but it is also certainly valid, and many, many, many people have, to simply read it as a farewell poem. It resonates equally well in both camps. There are some poets and some poems that really only do one of those very well. They're so clearly allegorical that reading it any other way just feels silly. A lot of the Cultural Revolution poems, for example, that's the reason they don't last long, is because there's only one way to read them.
With the one meaning that you can have.
Yeah, that's it. You've got the one. This one, you can read it as a farewell poem, or you can read it as a farewell to the dynasty poem.
So I think that's a pretty good place to end it. Rob, will we meet again on the other side?
Sure. The podcast, we're going to be so famous that we'll pretty much have to meet up, I think.
I think so. Anyways, Rob, it's been great for these past couple of years doing this with you face-to-face. Hopefully we'll keep doing this again.
We have to keep doing it. Well, we will keep doing it. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun doing it.
It's been
in the same room. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.